So, where are the next 10,000 DAOs going to come from? I think that Denver, right on. I think asking otherwise, and it's certainly the question that us at Aragon have been asking ourselves, especially the last year. Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably thinking, how this chick gonna know where the next 10,000 DAOs is going to come from? And so I'll start off by introducing myself. My name is Juliette. My Web2 friends call me Jules. You may see me on cyberspace as Juliette Chevalier, with a very cute search NFT. Essentially, I am a developer advocate for Aragon. For those of you who don't know what Aragon is, we build infrastructure for DAOs and have actually been doing so since 2017. Now, of course, because we've been doing it since 2017, that means that we currently have a wide array of projects going on. And essentially, in our product roadmap, we've decided that we're going to build just one consolidated product. Now, this is a great and exciting idea, but of course, it took us into a huge rabbit hole to better understand what the system was like and where it was headed. So let's start from the beginning. What does it look like today? Of course, the very first rock we stumbled upon was asking ourselves, how do we define a DAO? And I'm actually, excuse me, because the slides that are currently being presented are not the right ones. Just give me 1 second. Ooh. All right, yes. Now we're on. So the first rock we stumbled upon was, what is a DAO? And it seems to be actually a more controversial idea than we originally thought. We first came up with it with a simple definition of it's a collaborative token-enabled community. And so what this really means is that we have 3 big pillars that are going on throughout a DAO's progress. At the center stage, of course, the community, which are the ones being the core members of the team, the one contributing towards the project, the one in ownership and investing on it. Then we have the treasury, because in order for the community to execute work streams and progresses, we're actually tapping into the treasury and the funds. And because we're dealing with money, then that means we also need a coordination process, often called governance, often called voting, in which we decide where those funds will be distributed. Now, once we came up with this very simple definition of what DAOs really are, we then started studying the numbers. We got this information from DeepDAO and CoinMarketCap, and it was so interesting to see as I was preparing the slides how often these numbers changed. I think what really came up the most was seeing the rise of DAOs in the past 12 months. So only 12 months ago, the amount of governance token holders was around 130,000 people. Now it's 1.7 million. That's almost 130 times the amount of people within the ecosystem. Total treasuries, 9.1 billion US dollars. Market cap, 24 billion US dollars. And so we're seeing proper, decent money coming into the space. And when we mapped out the amount of organizations, we found out it was around 4,000. So the next step was going in deeper as to what those 4,000 organizations were really looking like. We went into on-chain data. We started querying the blockchain, and to our surprise, we wanted to understand the amount of DAOs that were actually active, which wasn't a simple query to find, right? And so we came up to figure out that the amount of DAOs active were really based on the amount of DAOs putting out proposals to their community. And what we saw was this graph that was very shocking. We were expecting something to be a bit more flat. No, organizations putting proposals once a week, once every few months. But really, we found out that it worked in spikes. We had organizations come in like active bursts and do a bunch of proposals over at 80 organizations at a given, 80 proposals at a given time. And then we just saw them decline. DAOs were doing active bursts of activity, but then they were disappearing off the map. Why? And so we started overlooking at the DAO activity throughout time. We found out that out of those 4,000 organizations, only 40% have been active within the last month. And out of the ones that were not active, 25% hadn't been active for over 800 days. So there was clearly something that was happening into the ecosystem that means that DAOs were essentially falling off the cracks. So after looking at the qualitative data, we realized we needed to do some research. And we started diving into user interviews. Now, user interviews originally started just being a quantitative approach. We wanted to speak to the most amount of user personas that were building and working in DAOs that we could. We reached out to our Twitter network, we reached out to our community, we reached out to people working in other DAOs. We focused on diversity, we focused on gender, we focused on geographical location. We tried to map out a holistic ecosystem of what was going on. And to our surprise, we realized that a lot of these people believed in the hype, they wanted to be a part of DAOs, but they weren't really focusing on the decision-making and in the building process of the DAOs. So they weren't understanding the struggles and the pain points of why these organizations were disappearing, but rather they were believing that they were going somewhere and really trying to sort of lurk around and look around organizations. So that led us to go in a bit of a pivot. And it meant that we needed to tap in really to the builders. What were the builders doing and where were they struggling? And we created a map that looks like this, where we wanted to understand, number one, the profile of the people, where they were coming in from, how they got into crypto, what skills they were bringing into the table. Then understand their inspiration and their goals, what drove them to want to create a DAO in the first place. Go through their journey. How do they get started? How do they get into today? Where are they headed? Why do they even run a DAO? Why not a company or an NGO? What does their community look like? What do their core members look like? What's their profiles? How does it extend and keep growing outside of that? What are their needs? And ultimately, what toolings were they using to fulfill those needs? And to our surprise, we came up with what we're calling now the intermediate builder. Why? Because the original wave of DAOs were the OGs, were the crypto people who were building these products by themselves. They didn't need any advisors. They didn't need any end-to-end service providers. They were coding this themselves, and they were doing really crypto-native products. But now that DAOs are becoming a bit more mainstream, then that means that that builder is not necessarily an advanced crypto OG human, but rather an intermediate builder. It's a person who knows WordPress, can automate flows through Zapier. It's not intimidated of Googling and reading documentations, but they're not necessarily a professional software engineer from 8 to 5, nor are they a noob. They're usually Web 2 entrepreneurs or Web 2.5 executives. They could be creator of communities with a large audience, influencers, product people. They're essentially tinkerers who are willing to play around and really decipher as they're going. Aside from that, they share a mindset. So they have this big complex vision of what their DAO should be and what it should do, mostly fenced off of referencing other DAOs that they've seen that have made it through the space. And ultimately, we really saw this big design upfront mentality. So they were referencing these bigger DAOs and they were saying, how could I implement this large vision that is already matured into the project that I'm trying to build? And ultimately, this only got even more complicated as you add in more people. So currently, the people contributing to DAOs come from all sorts of walks of life. I think I saw a stat the other day mentioning that VC funds are investing in DAOs to an extent of somewhere above 50%. So that means that you have different stakeholders. You have the Web3 workers, the engineers, the writers, the marketers. You have DAOs building products. So now they're also playing into the product ecosystem and understanding their user base. They're offering services, they're receiving services, they're implementing different frameworks, they're referencing other leading DAOs. And so we're seeing a very complex ecosystem to play with, which essentially leads to this. Across all of the interviews that we did, we saw these problems being referenced over and over again. Number one, tokenomics. Where does it start? Where does it end? How do I produce it, distribute it? What should the maximum supply be? It's super intimidating. It's very complex. How to stay legal? Our current regulation across the world is not set up for the rise of DAOs. How to make sure that the product that they're building is actually within the legal framework? That's scary. What about contributor reward frameworks? We're seeing globally across countries a great attrition of people leaving their jobs, not feeling empowered, not feeling motivated, not feeling adequately rewarded. That's something that is just translating as in the DAOs, we're really establishing a new way of working in the future of work. We're also seeing community management, onboarding, how to keep the lurkers and turn them into contributors that actually support the products of the organization. How to keep the community engaged so the voter participation is not low. And ultimately, it ends in confusion. Why? Because it's a nascent space, there's complex information everywhere, and we really have a strong confusion of the complexity that is being arised. These intermediate builders are having a hard time really crossing that chasm, and they're feeling alone. So they'll go into the web, they'll surf around, and they have a hard time mapping all of that all of that noise into signal that refers exactly to the use cases that they're building. There's a bunch of information out there, but how do I apply it to my specific idea? They're overthinking and getting ahead of themselves because there's so much to do that it becomes hard to decipher what that next step should be. And ultimately, because these smart contracts are set, deployed, and done, they feel like they can't experiment. And our biggest analysis conclusion was that those who jumped on the experimentation train were the ones who were actually able to cross the chasm. Why? Because they were grabbing these bigger, complex ideas and they were turning them into smaller packets of information that they can now start working on, iterating, moving over, testing stuff out, and moving forward. So originally, we started looking at a creation journey that looks like this. Got this information from SuperDAO. They're doing great research, and it really resonated with what we've been thinking. A person has an idea, then they gather a team. Once you have that team, you start working on a work stream of tasks that you want to be running. But then in order to implement them, you need funding. So you go through the initial funding. And if you have money, then you got to have some governance structure on top of that money to make sure you use it appropriately. Then that treasury becomes mature. So you start going through diversification techniques and start thinking of finance in a more complex way. And now you have money, so you work through the product development process until you eventually reach sustainability. But really, whenever we're building an organization, it's not a linear process, right? I think a big part of the creation journey is that it looks very much like a design thinking journey, where you're solving a problem with a cross-functional team of professionals until you iterate and hop on from one point to the next until you eventually get to where you want to be going. And so after many interviews, we realized that it was actually looking a lot more like this. First of all, the big thing to take from this is that builders were spending from 6 months to a year just learning what the space was about and what to do about it. So the learning and the testing phase, the rethinking of this was huge. And then once they actually accomplished it, they went through a set of emotions, right? They felt energized, then they felt sad, they felt frustrated, then they felt excited, they had a vision. And once they started testing, then they started actually launching and seeing the community grow and started dealing with a bit more complex problems. So after seeing a bit of that overview, we go back to the original question. Where are those next 10,000 DAOs going to come from? And like I said, we started looking at waves. So originally, the first DAOs came from the more crypto-native projects. They came from the DeFi protocols, the NFT collectors, the Web3 infrastructure builders. But as we've moved into a bit of the more mainstream waters, we've reached a bit of this second wave, where we're seeing the rise of investment DAOs, of VC DAOs, of gaming guilds with a big play-to-earn trend, creator communities where influencers and creators are really bringing back ownership to their audience, services, user-generated content platforms, and media. And this is where we're currently at. And then we're seeing a bit of the rise of this third wave, where we're seeing the transition of DAOs getting nicher and nicher. So we have the talent platforms, decentralized science. We're seeing people trying to get ownership and tokenization into real life assets and land. We're seeing social missions, social groups coming together. And really, we're mapping out a waves of seeing a transition of new DAOs that are nicher into their origin, nicher into their output, and nicher into their communities. And so ultimately, what we've realized is that the next 10,000 DAOs are merely going to come from the same place as the next 10,000 startups. Why? Because DAOs are essentially trying to build a product, provide a service, solve a problem, and it's the entrepreneurs, the builders, the tinkerers who will be creating these organizations. So what do these builders need, having all of that research laid out? Number one, they need simplicity. The current ecosystem is way too complex. And entrepreneurs, if we want them to thrive and survive, they need to have simple information being displayed to them so that their roadmap is easier to create. Number two, modularity. If we're really going to have organizations come from everywhere, then we need our tooling to be flexible. And we had this struggle in the beginning as well. Aragon, since we started since 2017, our first products were very monolithic and with a purpose. Back then, DAOs were even a more abstract, term than they are today. And so that meant that we needed to provide people with some concrete way of what it meant to go through and actually create a DAO. But now that organizations are spawning up from everywhere, people are getting more niche requests. And so that means that it no longer suffices them to get just one template to run everything that they can, but they actually want to be using different tooling specific to their goals. And the third one is that builders need their tooling to adapt with them. Like any organization, these organizations are growing and evolving at their own pace. We're all seeing how fast the crypto clock is running around. And if organizations are stuck in building the things where they first created, then we're in a bit of a pickle, and the organizations can't grow. So these are problems that I laid back earlier. We realized that they're not really problems. They're opportunities, and they're opportunities for tooling. Because the next DAO tooling will define where the next DAO generations come from, right? If we're building tooling for developers, then the next 10,000 DAOs will be DAOs for developers. If we're building tooling for creators, then the next 10,000 DAOs will be for creators. And so mapping out all of the existing problems that DAOs are currently struggling with, however tools will come out of that, will be the ones defining where these DAOs are headed. That's why in the last year, we spent a lot of time building the DAO Global Hackathon. We raised over $200,000 to give to winners, and we saw winners come up with innovations that are already kicking off in their own spaces. And it ultimately looks something like this. So we have a tool that comes through the organization. That tool then defines the culture of the organization, which then defines the coordination process that that organization is using, which will then define the next tooling that they use. And we're seeing this loop over and over as organizations are headed, and it's why that tooling is so important. It's why whomever is building DAO tooling needs to make sure that their tooling is agnostic to technologies. It needs to make sure that it's not opinionated, so that the creators and the builders themselves can actually enforce whatever they want to be building and create the product that need their output. Now, having that said, what are we doing with all this information? And like I said in the beginning, we're building a new product. The next product is meant to be a DAO platform that grows with you. It's meant to be adaptable. It's meant to be filled with integrations. We realized that the monolithic approach that worked in the beginning of DAOs doesn't suffice the builders of today. It needs to be flexible while also being human-centric and user-friendly. It needs to have learning integrated as you're building, and needs to be adaptable so that as you're going and evolving with your organization, your DAO platform grows with you. We're putting a big emphasis on integrations because we can't do it alone. And a lot of people are building great products that they should integrate into ours and create a better ecosystem as a whole. So we're going to have a strong SDK so that developers can come in and implement whatever tooling they want. And ultimately, the idea is that we're all going to make it together, especially at the speed that at which crypto is headed. We can't really pretend that we're the only ones who will make it out of this. And so the next strategy is to just allow for tools to be integrated and make sure that the tooling that we're building is agnostic, user-friendly, and allows for learning and experimentation to be a huge part of its success. Thank you very much.